Greetings and welcome back to PBH 275, Injury Prevention and Control. This week's module will discuss motor vehicle, bicycle, and pedestrian injuries. For this week's three injury topics, I'm going to discuss first of all the trends in the data, and I will talk about disparities in the data. Motor vehicle, bicycle, and pedestrian injuries are similar to a lot of other public health outcomes in that there's disparities amongst gender identity, racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic categories. We'll talk about some of the risk factors for these injuries and some of the preventive strategies. This table comes from WISCARS, and it highlights the top 10 leading causes of injury death in the United States. I've further highlighted motor vehicle traffic deaths in a slightly darker gray box. So what you can see is that unintentional motor vehicle traffic deaths were the third leading cause of injury death in the United States for all ages. And when we look at across different age spans, we see that from age 5 to 24, it's the leading cause of injury death. These are the ages of like from early to middle childhood all the way through adolescence and teenage years, and the years when people often get their driver's license, start to develop some autonomy, start driving more on their own, and of course, still don't have a ton of experience with operating a motor vehicle. So that's probably why in those particular ranges it's the leading cause of injury death. But then from 25 all the way through 65 plus, it's the second leading cause of injury death after poisoning for those between 25 and 64, and after falls, which is the leading cause of injury death in those over the age of 65. For several decades, really going back to back to the 1920s when automobiles first became available to many Americans after the cost went down thanks to some assembly line and other techniques. Really from that time on, motor vehicle crashes were the leading cause of unintentional injury death for several decades. And it wasn't until relatively recently, somewhere between 2010 and 2011, where unintentional poisonings overtook motor vehicle crashes as the leading cause of unintentional injury death. Of course, the poisonings deaths have been largely driven by overdoses, partly due to the opioid epidemic, but also because of some other reasons that overdoses have greatly increased. And we're going to talk about overdoses and other unintentional poisonings later in the semester. But as you can see, even though it's not the number one leading cause of injury death anymore, there's still anywhere between 30,000 and 45,000 people every year dying of motor vehicle collisions. Now, they're not all people inside cars. Sometimes they're people that get hit by cars. And you can also notice that the numbers had been kind of flat and maybe even reducing a little bit. But from 2013 to 2016, the motor vehicle crash deaths have been slowly inching up again. And so the public health interventions that we've been doing are maybe not working as well as they were a few years ago. And that's something we need to be serious about and try to address. What is true, and for which we can be thankful, is the fact that in the United States, motor vehicle fatalities have decreased greatly in the last several decades. If we look just from 1968 until today, the total number of motor vehicle fatalities in that time has decreased by more than 40%. This despite the fact that since 1968, there are a lot more cars on the roads in the United States. There's a lot more miles driven, total and also per vehicle and per driver than used to be. And there's been a significant population increase since 1968. But the total number of motor vehicle fatalities have decreased by greater than 40%. That's very good. When you compare the United States to some of its peer nations, though, the other high-income, high GDP nations, what you see is that in those countries, the decrease has been greater. They've decreased their motor vehicle fatalities by greater than 60% in that same time period. I want you to think about why that is, that though wonderful progress has been made in the United States, some of our developed high-income peer nations have done even better. Some of the data I show you in the next couple slides might reveal one of the reasons why that is, which is that not every other country that's high income has had the same escalation in total number of cars and total miles driven per person that the United States does. Just for cultural reasons, geographic reasons. The United States is a really big country with a lot of rural areas where driving has remained a necessity, whereas in other smaller, more developed countries with more, for example, public transit infrastructure, driving has been not as emphasized. But anyways, don't want to belittle the progress too much that's occurred because it has been significant and it's very good. The next two slides from Bandy and colleagues are just some illustrations of some of the points that we've talked about up to this point. The solid black line you see is the total vehicle miles traveled per 100,000 people. So this is adjusted for population. If we looked at total vehicle miles traveled, not adjusted for population, it would be even steeper because the U.S. population has increased so much from 1968 to 2010. But even with this per 100,000 adjustment, you still see that the vehicle miles traveled per person has gone up, and up. Looks like around 2007 it started to plateau and go down a little bit, but for the most part, it's only gone up. So therefore, people have been exposed to the hazards of vehicle travel more and more over those decades. But then you look at the fatality rates, you see that, again, they fitted the lines here. The little diamonds and circles are the actual rates per year, and then they fitted lines to them. And you can see the blue line for males consistently has been going down. The red line for females has been going down, maybe not as steeply, but part of that's because there's always been a gender difference in motor vehicle traffic fatality rates. Always been much more prevalent among males than females, so there was more room for improvement among males than for females, which is why their improvement curve has been a little steeper. Here are four more graphs from the Bandy and colleagues study. This shows motor vehicle crash fatality data for four different age groups from 1968 through 2010. Pay attention to the little green circled areas because this shows you that for each of the four age groups, the deaths per 100,000 are on different scales because the magnitude of deaths per 100,000 is so much greater in, say, the 15 to 24 range than it is in the 1 to 14 range. So that's why there's differences in scale, but you can kind of see that that some trends emerge, that the death rate continues to go down on a fairly smooth basis from 1968 toward 2010. You notice in the age group 25 to 64, there's a bit of an increase from 1999 to 2006, where fatality rates per 100,000 goes up about 1.6%, but then after 2006 it goes down again. You also see that for all four of these age categories, that males have a consistently higher death rate than females. Interestingly enough, this even shows up in the 1 to 14 years category you see in the upper left. This is before before people are even eligible to drive. So therefore, these are strictly passengers. They're children passengers that are riding in vehicles, and that the rate is still higher for males compared to females. What's also interesting is that, and this is something that will be borne out with later data I show you, the greatest risk for dying in a motor vehicle collision is when your age is 15 to 24, when you're starting to drive, and therefore you don't have a lot of experience yet, and maybe you're more likely to engage in risk-taking behavior, particularly among people who are born male. And also, your risk is pretty high once you get over the age of 65. As we'll see later on, and for those of you that did the Whiskers data assignment and used motor vehicle crashes as your output, you probably noticed that the highest per capita, per 100,000 rate of fatalities in motor vehicle crashes is actually for people over the age of 85. Which does make sense if you think about it. People over that age are if they are still driving a car or riding in a car, there's probably some visual impairments. There's certainly some fragilities that come with age. So anyways, this is just a preliminary, interesting look at the data. I reminded you of this during the WISCARS assignment, but also just once again, one of the limitations of our data is that data has historically and continues to use only binary classifications for gender, either male or female, without any alternate categories. This is a limitation that probably will get addressed in the future, but as of now, most of the injury data you've come across will have binary definitions of gender. One of the single biggest reasons why total motor vehicle fatalities have decreased so much for several decades are the engineering changes that have made cars and highways safer. Almost every car on the road these days has not just airbags for the steering wheel, but for the front passengers, and there's also side curtain airbags, and some cars even have rear seat airbags now to absorb a lot of crash energy in a collision. A lot of cars have sidebars and structural members so that if you're sideswiped, rather than the passenger compartment crushing inward, which is where you are, it tends to stay more rigid. Headrests, which are more properly called head restraints, have prevented a lot of neck and spinal injuries whenever people are rear-ended in cars. The advent of divided highways has helped a lot as well, because at least when everything is being done the way it's supposed to be and everyone is driving correctly, the people in the lanes next to you are generally going in the same direction as you, which, again, one of the greatest forces that can be exerted in a motor vehicle collision is a head-on collision where two vehicles are going in opposite directions and then hit each other. Well, divided highways reduce that risk. Things like rumble strips help keep drivers awake and alert and give them a warning that they're about to maybe run off the road. All of these things have helped. What's also helped is that safety has gone from sort of something that car manufacturers didn't want to put on because it would make their cars more expensive and heavier, to something that consumers demand. We talked a little bit about that with the Corvair in the History and Epidemiology of Injury Prevention lecture earlier in the semester, that the Corvair was an example of how a car was not made as safe as it could be because there was a belief that unless there's some uniform standard that apply to all car makers, nobody wants to be the first to make their car heavier and perform less well in order to integrate safety features. Well, now safety features are a selling point. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration actually uses their 5-star safety rating program as a way to sort of rank cars based on which ones do the best in front-end collisions, in side impact collisions, and single point elastic collisions, several different things. And car manufacturers use this NHTSA data in their advertising as well to say, like, our car has the highest safety rating. So that's been a tremendous change, and it's been a good change. However, even if there was a little bit of an uptick between 2014 and 2016, for the most part, motor vehicle crash injury death trends in the United States have gone in a positive direction. The fatalities have decreased by more than 40% since 1968, even though since that time, there are a lot more people in the U.S., there's more cars, there's more vehicle miles driven than there was back in 1968, yet we still have more than a 40% decrease in total motor vehicle crash fatalities. So that's good. However, when you compare the rates in the U.S. with the rates in other developed countries, particularly in Western Europe, you will notice that in those regions, they've managed to, and during that same period of time, to reduce their motor vehicle fatalities by more than 60%. So they're doing an even better job in other countries, developed countries, than we are in the United States. If you wonder why, a lot of it probably has to do with the fact that because of our living patterns here in the U.S., where we don't live in as many densely populated areas, there's a lot more rural areas, there's a lot more people that have to drive to get to work. We don't have densely populated urban areas with particularly good public transit systems available in all but the largest cities. So this is part of the reason why, though our rates have gone in a good direction, the rates have gone even better in some of the other developed countries in the world. You'll remember early on we talked about how consumer advocate Ralph Nader made the case that vehicles could be designed to be safer, but auto manufacturers were choosing not to do so because that would make cars more expensive and they would lose market share unless all their competitors were also forced to make their cars safer, which is exactly what happened when we founded the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in response to public pressures from Ralph Nader's book. Since then, there's been a lot of other engineering changes that have made cars and highways safer. There have been the addition of airbags and sidebars and crumple zones, headrests, which cars did not used to have, so that if you got rear-ended, you were a lot more likely to suffer whiplash injury. We have divided highways now, so at least theoretically, all traffic should be moving in the same direction on your side of the road. There are rumble strips to notify you when you're crossing a lane and entering into a dangerous place. We have speed limits now, and there are many other programs as well. It's also we've kind of made safety in cars a competition, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has encouraged this with their 5-star safety rating program, where the slogan is "More stars means safer cars." And there's a lot of cars that have actually advertised themselves as having a 5-star safety rating. And you can go to the hyperlink there if you want to know more details about the 5-star safety rating program. But every car gets a numerical score based on how it performs in front end crumple crashes and sort of pole crashes and side beam crashes, rear end crashes, and it all goes into giving a safety rating to cars. So now safety is actually incentivized to be safer because it's a selling point. Whereas back in the early to mid 1960s, safety was not a selling point because it would make the car more expensive. So I would say that's definitely a net improvement in public health. Another change that I've observed within my own lifetime is that, in general, drivers exhibit more safe behaviors with their vehicles than used to happen in maybe the 70s and early 1980s. Seatbelts were not always commonly worn when I was a kid. And this was also a time when people were a little bit more likely to drive while lightly to moderately intoxicated. It was not seen as a very big deal back then. But then what happened is an accumulation of tragic incidents where the toll of not having proper safety belt usage or people driving while under the influence, the accumulated toll of that was noted, and along with some very activists who were personally touched by some of these incidents. And what a lot of these activists did was they started to lobby for new laws. And as public health minded people, I don't need to tell you that laws and enforcement of laws is not a perfect method for creating a societal change that leads to better outcomes, because law enforcement often disproportionately falls on minority populations and on economically disadvantaged populations. But what the activism and the lobbying and even the enforcement of the laws did was it altered social norms and social expectations, so that over the course of a generation, collectively, the consciousness just changed about seatbelts and about driving under the influence. I would guess that most of you never think twice about this. If you're ever driving people around in your car, you we all now subtly wait to make sure that everybody has found the receiver for their seatbelt and then fasten their seatbelt before we take off. We wait to hear those clicks. And that just was not always the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. And with the advent of ride shares and many other programs available, where a lot of the reasons why people used to justify driving while under the influence, since a lot of that is not in play anymore and just the social norms have changed, there's not as much driving while under the influence as there used to be. There's another unsafe behavior that I used to observe and also, frankly, participate in when I was a child, which is riding in the back of a truck at highway speeds. This is just something that you thankfully almost never see anymore. But when I was a kid, it used to happen all the time. We thought it was fun. We'd come back from pool parties and all pile on the back of a truck, and it was considered to be a fun thing. Well, when you're riding in the back of a truck, I mean, it should be obvious why this is a bad idea. There's literally no crash protection back there. There's no belts, there's no airbags, there's literally nothing to protect you from absorbing just a ton of crash force and being thrown clear from a vehicle in the event that something does happen. Riding in truck beds is so inherently hazardous that it can actually be the basis for a child neglect charge for a parent or caregiver if they're driving somebody under the age of 18 in the back of a truck bed. Even if it's a child who wants to be back there, who thinks it's fun, it's such an inherently hazardous activity that you're not permitted to do it. On the right, we have a picture of what's called a Subaru Brat. This was a vehicle that was manufactured from about 1977 to 1985, and it was a little miniature truck. It actually had these what were called jump seats in the back bed. There were no seat belts associated with these jump seats, and you look at them, they were clearly intended to have people ride back there at highway speeds. Uh, a lot of people died in the back of these Subarus. Unfortunately, a lot of people actually were literally decapitated on some of the more grisly collisions that occurred with riders in the back there. But so thankfully, in the modern era, you would never see any vehicle equipped with something so obviously dangerous. If you're wondering about the laws here in the state of Nevada, you are permitted to ride in the back of a truck bed if you're over the age of 18. If you're younger than that, there's only some very limited exceptions where you can ride in the back of a truck. If the vehicles are being used in farming or ranching activities at very low speeds on unpaved roads, that is permitted. You can also do it when the bed is covered by a camper shell, even though that, you know, still doesn't solve the problem of like there's not really seat belts and things and airbags and other protective things back there, but at least that keeps who's ever back there from being ejected in a crash. You can also ride in the back of a truck if you're part of an authorized parade. But that's it. Otherwise, it's not a permitted activity for those under the age of 18. Another dramatic safety improvement I've seen within my lifetime is the widespread usage of infant and child car seats. As recently as 4 or 5 decades ago, these really were not a thing. When I was a small child, children used to ride in the laps of their caregivers when they were in a vehicle, because caregivers recognized that seat belts were not appropriate for children. They were not the right size for them, but there was no real other thing to do, and so there were a lot of child and infant fatalities because they were not restrained properly inside a car. Starting in about the mid 1980s, car seats for children and infants became a little bit more of a thing, partly because the federal government started tying highway dollar grants to whether states had and enforced child car seat laws. And part of the federal government, what they would do when they gave highway dollars, they would also extend grants to states and local governments that wanted to be able to provide these safety seats to low-income persons or other people who might not be able to get one on the open market. So if you're wondering, what are these laws here in the state of Nevada? Because Nevada was like every other state. They wanted to continue to receive federal highway dollars, so they adapted some child restraint system laws. In Nevada, any children under the age of 6 years old in a vehicle must be in a child restraint system. From birth to age 2, these child restraint systems, or what we call infant car seats, they must be rear facing. In other words, not facing toward the back of the vehicle, not the front. And if the car that the infant is riding in has a back seat, they're supposed to be placed in the back seat. If there's a situation where the seat cannot be put in the back, maybe the car doesn't have a back seat, then if it's going to be in the front seat, then the question is the passenger side airbag capable of being deactivated? Because if so, it needs to be deactivated. The thing with these rear-facing infant and young child car seats is if an explosive detonation of an airbag happens, it would actually compress and put a lot of force on the child, and that's not something that anyone wants to have happen. So that's why the laws say that you have to be in the back seat if applicable, and the airbag must be deactivated if they're going to be in the front seat, if it's capable of that. Some older cars are not. From ages 2 to 6, it's okay based on the size of the child to maybe start putting them into forward-facing car seats. And then after age 6, at this point, children can start to wear safety belts, the actual safety belts inside the vehicle, provided that they're big enough. They might have to wear belt positioning booster seats all the way up till about age 8, or longer if the child is not tall enough to wear belts unboosted. Usually you have to be about 4 feet 9 inches tall for lap and shoulder belts inside a vehicle to fit properly. Anyone that's smaller than that probably needs to be wearing a belt positioning booster seat. There's always going to be some danger if you're in a motor vehicle collision, even if you're in the most safe, most modern car, just because there are a lot of different forces at work when you're in a motor vehicle collision. There's actually 3 types of collisions that occur. First of all is the vehicle collision, of course, where the car, or whatever vehicle it is, crashes against another object. There's a massive transfer of force that happens during that. There's the collision of the human, where the passenger will, or the driver, as it were, will collide against the interior of the car. Certainly, things such as side curtain airbags and crumple zones and things like that can sort of absorb some of this energy to minimize how hard a passenger can hit against the interior of the car. Seatbelts are also designed to sort of absorb a little bit of this, but it's still going to be a lot of force against the interior of the car, even if it's just the seatbelt that you collide against. It's still going to be a lot of force in the areas where the seatbelt touches you. And then, of course, there's the internal collisions that occur, where the passenger's internal organs can collide against solid structures of the body. A very common one that happens in a lot of collisions, particularly rear-end collisions, would be concussions, where the brain actually sort of collides with the interior of the skull. And that can be a very traumatic brain injury if there's a lot of force applied. Like many other public health issues, there are some disparities in who suffers from motor vehicle fatalities. The age of the driver is a big risk factor. Driver youth and inexperience is probably one of the most important risk factors and frequency of getting into not just fatal collisions, but also non-fatal but injurious collisions. What's been shown is that for a 16-year-old driver, the crash rate is about 3 times the rate of a 17-year-old driver and about 5 times greater than the rate of an 18-year-old driver. So 16 is when a lot of people get graduated licenses, learner's permits, or in some states even full release driver's licenses. But you can see, and the data shows this year after year, that just getting 1 year of experience and then 2 years of experience behind the wheel of a car makes a huge difference in crash rates. We know that for those aged 16 to 19 years old, the fatal involvement rate per 100 million miles traveled is about 3 times the overall rate for all drivers. This is part of the reason why the youngest drivers often have very high insurance rates. What's interesting, though, is if you look at the total data for motor vehicle fatal injuries per 100,000, so adjusted for differences in population level at each age group, the highest rate of fatal injuries per 100K in motor vehicles is in the 85 plus age category. That was discussed earlier, and you can understand why that probably is the case. Gender identity is another disparity in these rates. With those who identify as male are involved in many more fatal crashes per 100,000. The rate is 19.7 versus 7.4 per 100K for those who identify as female. But beyond just fatal crashes, non-fatal injury crashes and non-fatal crashes that don't result in injuries but result in property damage are also elevated in those who identify as male, though not to the same degree as fatal crashes where the rate is more than double. And then there are some racial and ethnic differences as well. The highest rate of fatal crashes by far when we look at racial and ethnic groups is among American Indian and Alaska Native populations. One more illustration of this. This is fatal injury crashes per 100,000. You see that around the years 1979 and 1980 were the highest rates for these, and then they've been steadily going down. But you also see there's a profound gender difference because the blue bars represent males, the white bars represent females. That the rate for females has consistently been between 10 and 20 fatal crashes per 100,000, whereas for males it's gone up from near 70 to down around 30, but has consistently been much higher than the rate for females. And if you look down at the bottom two graphs for non-fatal injury crashes and property damage crashes, you see the same thing. It's not quite as profound of a difference. It's not more than double like it is for fatalities, but again, year after year, this is what you see. So besides younger people having to pay more for car insurance, this is also why car insurance is uniformly more expensive for males than for females, because of this data right here. When we start to look at risk factors for motor vehicle crashes, this should not surprise you that alcohol is the most frequent human factor in fatal crashes, and in fact about 40% of all traffic fatalities per year, alcohol is involved in some fashion. The time of day can be another risk factor. About 60% of all deaths occur during the day. You can see better during the day, but that's also when more people are on the road because that's when people are commuting to and from work, particularly the afternoon rush hour when people have had a full day of work. Again, this is in the pre-COVID era, and are then driving home a little bit tired, a little bit, maybe a little bit grumpy. This is when a lot of fatal motor vehicle collisions occur. We do know if we look strictly based on mileage that death rates in motor vehicle collisions are 2 times higher at night. Again, it's because you can't see as far. You can't always see the obstacle, whether it's a coyote or a pedestrian or whatever, or another car, whatever it is. But because in general people drive less at night than during the daytime, more of the collisions actually happen during the day, 60%. In terms of rates, these collisions and deaths happen more frequently in rural areas. Again, that doesn't mean more collisions and deaths happen. It just means that the rate of fatal collision per population unit is higher in rural areas. And there's a lot of reasons why this is the case. People that live in rural areas tend to drive more miles because services and other things are farther away. They might not be as likely to wear things like seatbelts, even though that is becoming the social norm even in rural areas. There can be differing alcohol use patterns. Rural roads in general can sometimes be less safe. People can drive faster on them because there's less traffic. And if you're in an incident, the tertiary medical attention that you might need to save your life, it might be a little while before it shows up compared to if you're in an urban area. And non-fatal crashes are more frequent in urban areas, kind of the converse of what we just talked about, where there are more people in cars, but the cars in general are going slower, and in the event of an injury crash, medical attention is usually available quicker. It would not surprise you to learn that the size of car also makes a difference. The small cars tend to fare worse in collisions compared to larger vehicles. What has been consistently shown in many studies, including the McAvoy and colleagues study that I'm quoting here in the first 2 bullet points of the slide, is that cell phone use is a very significant distraction if you're driving. It's generally been associated in repeated studies with about a 4-fold increase in crashes. From the McAvoy study, it was found that if you're using a handheld cell phone, you had about a hazard ratio of about 4.9. In other words, you're 4.9 times more likely to be in a crash than if you were not on a cell phone. What's been repeatedly found, too, is that hands-free devices help a little bit, but not as much as you would think. There's still a 3.8-fold increased risk in collisions if you're using a hands-free cell phone. I've heard people say that hands-free cell phones is no different than talking to a passenger in your vehicle, but that's not entirely true. When you're talking to somebody on a hands-free device, you have to pay a little bit more attention because you can't see body language. They're not right there with you. You have to, my own personal experience has been when you're talking on a cell phone, you have to concentrate quite a bit more than if you're talking to somebody who's sitting next to you or in the back seat or what have you. And the data appears to reflect this. For young drivers, those aged 16 to 19, they're about 3.8 times more likely to be involved in a crash while texting. I hope those of you who have made it this far in the public health curriculum, or whatever other curriculum you're in if you're not a public health major, realize by now that you should never, ever, ever text and drive. And we have laws that say you can't do that as well. 48 states, plus the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands all ban texting while driving, a complete and utter ban for all ages. The only holdouts are Missouri and Montana. And even Missouri, you're not allowed to text and drive if you're under the age of 21. Montana is the only state that has no law banning texting in the car at all. Furthermore, 20 states, which includes Nevada, along with DC, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, ban the use of handheld devices while driving. Because as we talked about earlier in this slide, even using a hands-free device, it's still considered a significant distraction. That's been shown in many studies. And it's just, handheld devices are not completely protective against this hazard. And 39 states and the District of Columbia ban all cell phone use by novice drivers. Nevada is not included among those states. Back in the summer of 2016, there was a new distraction introduced that briefly sort of took the U.S. by storm, and that was the Pokemon Go craze. Some people made the rather unfortunate choice to try to collect and catch the Pokemon while they were driving. And so Ayers and colleagues actually wrote a paper about this in JAMA Internal Medicine. And during a 10-day period in July, there were 14 crashes that were linked to the smartphone game Pokemon Go during a 10-day period. And it was found that in a lot of these cases, people were chasing the Pokemon in a vehicle. Not always as a driver, sometimes as a passenger. An analysis of Pokemon Go related tweets from this period, during the peak in popularity of the game, found that about 18% of the tweets from that period indicated that a person was playing while driving. 11% of the tweets indicated that a passenger was playing. And about 4% indicated pedestrian distraction. For example, somebody tweeting something like, almost got hit by a car while playing Pokemon Go. Thankfully, in the study basin, there was only one unique crash that could be documented as being caused by a player actively playing Pokemon Go and then crashing their vehicle. And it was a player who drove their car into a tree. They weren't fatally injured, but still, this was an example of a new form of distracted driving that's just from one study in the San Diego County seemed to indicate that it was a widespread problem. When we talk about prevention of injuries and fatalities from motor vehicle collisions, One of the most important preventive strategies is actually making safer vehicles. And we have made safer vehicles. We know that seat belts, if properly worn, reduce serious injuries by 69%. They reduce fatalities by 45%. Since 1964, all passenger vehicles in the U.S. have had seat belts. Now, shoulder belts weren't added until 1968, partly under pressure from Ralph Nader at Unsafe at Any Speed. And one of the sad facts is that during those several years when cars had lap belts but not shoulder belts, this is when a lot of people sort of started to develop an anti-seatbelt mentality that they didn't want to wear seatbelts. And it was because back when there was only lap belts available, a lot of times when people got into motor vehicle collisions, they would have their lap belt on. They wouldn't be ejected from the vehicle. They would survive the collision, but the lap belt would inflict a severe and traumatic injury to their spinal cord. And this is where a lot of that sort of mythology that I told you about before, where people imagine that it would be better to fly through the windshield than to be stuck in this big kinetic box. That's where a lot of it came from. Thankfully, since about 1968, which is the beginning point for a lot of the data I've shown you, cars have had both lap belts and shoulder belts. You got to have them both. If you just have one or the other, you're not going to be adequately protected. Airbags, when they're used in combination with seat belts, reduce mortality by 80%. There's a lot of energy transfer that occurs during a collision. So front airbags and in recent years side airbags have really helped a lot to sort of keep a lot of that kinetic energy from being delivered to the fragile passengers in a vehicle. A well-designed car will have crumple zones in the front and in the back. So if you're in a front-end collision or a rear-end collision, they're designed to sort of crumple and absorb a lot of that energy before it gets to the passenger compartment. Now, if you're in a rollover or if you're hit on the side, you kind of want the opposite. You kind of want to have extra structural integrity so that the passenger compartment does not get breached or compromised or crunched in the event of a motor vehicle crash. That's where things like side roll bars have come into place that have helped sort of improve the structural integrity of the passenger compartment in a vehicle. Graduated driver's licenses have become more of a thing in recent years. Back in the 1980s, where I grew up in Illinois, they really weren't a thing. Once you turned 16, if you could pass the driving test and you'd had driver's ed in school, you were given a license, no questions asked, no restrictions put on it. Since then, Illinois and many other states have adopted graduated driver's licenses, and the really comprehensive graduated driver's licensing programs are associated with a 40% reduction in crashes among 16-year-olds, which, as we talked about earlier, that's a very fragile, very delicate time when the risk of being in a crash is the highest because you have inexperienced drivers. Their sort of matrix of risk-taking decisions is not fully formed. So some of these comprehensive graduated programs, some of the elements that are included that the evidence shows work is if you have a 3-month mandatory waiting period after you turn 16 before you can get a license, nighttime driving restrictions. In a lot of states, once you get your license, you can't drive in the nighttime until several months have passed. And you have to have at least 30 hours of supervised driving, or you have to have a passenger restriction, meaning that you can't, there's only so many people under the age of 18 that can be in the vehicle at the same time. And all of these elements of a comprehensive program have helped to make a pretty serious reduction in crashes among our youngest, most inexperienced drivers. Another thing, if you're a young and inexperienced driver, is that most states, including Nevada, actually have a zero tolerance level for blood alcohol if you're under the age of 21, an age when you shouldn't be drinking at all. In most of the states of the union, the blood alcohol level that we get you arrested for DWI, if you're an adult, is 0.08% blood alcohol. If you're under the age of 21, though, in Nevada, it's 0.02. There's just a tiny bit of tolerance given in the event that you, I don't know, are taking medicines that have alcohol in them, or some alcohol for some other reason. But a lot of states, the zero tolerance actually means zero, meaning you have to have 0.00% alcohol in your blood at all times if you're operating a vehicle and you're under the age of 21, or you'll get arrested. Once you reach the legal drinking age in the United States, which is 21 across all states and territories, there are laws in place to ensure that you don't have an elevated blood alcohol when you're driving, because this is, like we talked about before, a major risk factor for motor vehicle collisions. Back in 2000, Congress passed an Appropriations Act for the Department of Transportation. And as part of the appropriations, in other words, if DOT was going to get their money, there had to be an adoption of 0.08% blood alcohol as the national limit for impairment. There were some states before the year 2000 that actually had a BAC, blood alcohol content levels, higher than 0.08 to be legally impaired. The stick that sort of went with this to ensure that it was enforced was that if you were a state that was not complying with 0.08 as your legal limit by the year 2003, you would lose 2% of your federal highway construction funds every year that you did not comply. So, of course, every state is now in compliance with this, and in fact, Utah has taken it a step further. Utah is the first state in the United States that's actually lowered the blood alcohol content legal limit below 0.08. It's 0.05 if you're in Utah. Please keep that in mind if you ever take any road trips to Utah. It does not take very much alcohol at all, especially at high elevation, to get your blood alcohol at 0.05. What a lot of states have adopted too, basically every state except Hawaii and Mississippi, is an enhanced penalty blood alcohol content level, where if you get at this level, and these levels can be between 0.15 and 0.2, you can be subjected to felony DUI charges. You can have your car impounded. You can have to go immediately to jail. The enhanced penalties will vary by state, but there's an enhanced penalty threshold that every state except Hawaii and Mississippi has. And while most of us in the public health field agree that trying to change behavior through fear of punishment is generally not an effective method of trying to get people to adopt safer and healthier choices, deterrence laws have had some positive effect in reducing the amount of driving under the influence that occurs, and also adjusting the social norms about drinking and driving being acceptable or not. Some of these deterrence laws include losing your license, being charged with having an open container in your vehicle, even if nobody, including especially the driver, is actually drinking it. Sobriety checkpoints, where you can just be driving along on a Friday night and suddenly there's a checkpoint and you've got to take a breathalyzer. Passive alcohol sensors, and also alcohol interlocks, where if you've maybe been charged with DUI before, they put an interlock on your car so that if you want to start your car, you actually have to blow into the tube and verify that you're not legally intoxicated or have any alcohol in your system before your car will start. Cars have undoubtedly gotten safer as a result of driver assistance technologies that are becoming more common in cars. For example, warning systems that let you know if there's a vehicle in your blind spot, or if there's something in front of you that you're coming up to at a great deal of speed, the forward collision warnings that sometimes start buzzing to let you know it's time to press on the brake right now. Lane departure warning systems, where if you cross a line other than for a pass and you don't have your turn signal on, it will signal that. And also rear cross traffic warning systems. Autonomous and semi-autonomous systems are also being developed and tested right here in the Las Vegas Valley and many other places, where the car will actually brake for you in emergency situations, like if there's a forward collision that's imminent, and it will do the braking for you. And also fully driverless systems. The technology is not perfected yet, but it's something that's being worked on. The thing to remember with all these driver assistance technologies, including autonomous systems, is that is that they do not change the underlying physics of vehicles. You're still in a several ton metal and plastic box going at often at high rates of speed. If you have to suddenly slow down because you crash into something, regardless of what systems are in place, that underlying physics does not change. So our reliance on vehicles in our culture is just kind of a fundamental problem that technology can help with, but is not going to fully fix. Here's just one example of that underlying physics problem I was talking about before. Rivian makes the electric trucks and SUVs. Back in 2022, they had an edition called the R1T Launch Edition. It's fully electric and has 4 quad motors, basically one at each wheel. It has numerous driver and passenger safety features to protect you in the event of a collision. But the problem with the Rivian and with a lot of battery-powered vehicles is that they're very heavy. The curb weight of this Rivian is 7,173 pounds, or 3,254 kilograms. It also is incredibly fast. It can go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3.3 seconds. So basically, when you're talking about a giant brick that can accelerate that quickly, it doesn't matter how good of a driver you are, how many maybe driver assistance systems you have, that is a recipe for danger, particularly for vulnerable road users such as bicyclists and pedestrians, which we're going to talk about next. We are now going to shift our attention away from motor vehicles and onto what I call vulnerable road users, bicyclists and pedestrians. The reason why I call them vulnerable road users, well, they don't have a box of several tons of metal around them. They don't have seat belts and airbags and other things to absorb crash energy. If they run into objects or get struck by motor vehicles, they're quite vulnerable. The graphic you see here on the right comes from the Federal Highway Administration. It's a little bit dated now. It's from 2012, but it shows that, based on surveys data, that a little over 11% of all trips in a given year are taken by bicycle or on foot. And a disproportionate number of roadway fatalities are pedestrians and bicyclists. From this 2012 data, which was aggregated from several years before, it was 14.9% of all roadway fatalities were pedestrians and bicyclists. And of course, federal transportation funding goes largely toward highway and road infrastructure for vehicles. With, at the time, only 2.1% of federal transportation funding went to bicycling and walking projects. That number is not necessarily much greater in the modern times. I will give you a quick update, though, on that as of 2023, the numbers for roadway fatalities are even more grim. About 20% of all roadway fatalities are vulnerable road users, with 18% of those being pedestrians and 2% being bicyclists. We'll start with bicycle injuries, which, as I said before, represented 2% of all traffic fatalities in the year 2023. What's the cost of injury data? Well, as you know, that's readily available in WSCARS, and there are some estimations that are involved in WSCAR's cost of injury data, but it's pretty sound methodologically. And from this year's bicycle fatalities, there was a total cost for deaths alone of $10.07 billion. For those cases that required hospitalization, inpatient hospitalization, the total cost came up to about $13.23 billion. And for those that did not require hospitalization but required a visit to an emergency department or emergency room, the total cost was $24.81 billion. If we want to talk about disparities amongst bicycle deaths, well, specific age groups have increased rates. I know it's a little hard to see the graph that's up on this slide, but what's really clear from looking at this graph is that almost none of the bicycle fatalities are very young children. The largest proportion of bicycle fatalities are actually amongst adults groups, specifically adult males ages 55 to 69. There's a point in life when people are mostly riding for either transportation or for recreation, and oftentimes on highways and open roads. You can also see a profound gender identity difference when you compare the orange bars to the green bars. Those who identify as male accounted for almost 89% of all bicycle fatalities and 77% of all non-fatal bicycle injuries. If you're wondering what is the most frequent motor vehicle and bicycle type of collision, well, thankfully, the one that happens the most frequently doesn't often tend to be fatal for the bicyclist, but it can certainly cause serious injuries and property damage as well. The most frequent type of bicycle and motor vehicle collision occurs when a motor vehicle is turning right and a cyclist is coming up from the driver's right side. There might be a dedicated bicycle lane for the cyclist, or there might not, and they might just be riding on the right side of the road, as is the tradition whenever there is no bicycle lane. So what a motorist might do is that if they're getting ready to turn right, is they want to focus on the most relevant direction to them, which is the left, because that might be where traffic is coming, and they need to stop and make sure that that is clear before they make a right turn. And so they might not pay attention to what they consider to be the less relevant thing, which is the right side of their car, which a bicycle might be coming up on. And so a lot of side swipe incidents happen where a motor vehicle turns in front of a bicyclist or sort of squeezes a bicyclist a little bit while making a turn. Now, safety professionals do not always agree on the best way to do urban design to avoid this type of collision. There's been a few different things that have been tried, but that is by far the most frequent type of motor vehicle and bicycle collision. So the scenario I just presented you is the most frequent motor vehicle and bicycle collision. It's not generally the most serious because usually it happens at lower speeds. You hit the side of a car and you might get injured from that, but the most serious types of bicycle injuries occur at higher speeds of either the bicyclist or especially the motorist. Most high-speed roads in the United States do not have dedicated bike lanes. Bicyclists are expected to ride over to the right as far as they can, sometimes on the shoulders. Many high-speed roads in the U.S. do not even have what's considered to be rideable shoulders. They will have those rub strips on the right to alert drivers that they're veering too far to the right. Well, you can't really ride a bicycle over those. And if there's any shoulder to the right of those rub strips, it's often littered with road debris and things like that. So a lot of our high-speed roads are really not designed for safe operation of bicycles. For that reason, it's 100% a requirement that bicycles need to be visible and drivers need to be alert on any high-speed roads. The kinetic difference between being struck by a vehicle going 20 miles per hour and 40 miles per hour is just immense. Basically, your risk of dying in a bicycle collision increases by 1,000% if you're hit by a vehicle going 40 miles per hour versus a vehicle going 20 miles per hour. While a lot of different orthopedic injuries are often the result of bicycle motor vehicle collisions, or just even bicycles into other object collisions, the most common type of bicycle injury following a collision is a head injury. It's estimated that 62% of all bicycle-related collision deaths are caused by severe head injuries. 7% of all traumatic brain injuries that occur in the U.S. are caused by bicycle crashes. We know that helmets can protect from brain injuries. They can absorb a great deal of shock and prevent it from being transmitted into the skull and then into the brain. Helmets can also protect from facial injuries as well, because the brims that stick out on the fronts of helmets can actually, besides absorbing shock from frontal collisions, they also can sort of provide a little bit of space between your face and the ground. So they can prevent facial injuries as well as brain injuries. Public health at the local level has done a pretty good job here in the U.S. of promoting helmet use in children, and not just for bicycles, but also for riding scooters and skateboards and inline skates and many other things where a balance problem could cause a fall and possibly a head injury. Adult use of helmets has not been promoted as much as it probably should be. An estimate from 2012 is that about 15% of children under the age of 15 years use a helmet for every single one of their bicycle rides. I know a lot of times kids just ride very locally, just around the property or around the block or things like that. But still, that's an awful lot of children who are not wearing helmets while riding bicycles. The reasons given for not wearing a helmet is that it's uncomfortable, annoying, you get hot wearing them, I've got good balance, I don't need it, or I don't own one. This comes from the Finoff paper in Pediatrics you see here. You can form norms within a household as well. Children are a lot more likely to wear a helmet if their parents wear one when they ride. So in order to assess what kind of protective factor that you get from helmets in the event of a bicycle crash, the Thompson Research Group, whose materials I'm going to reference on this slide, did a couple of different studies of this. There were case control studies where they looked at bicycle injuries. In the first one from 1996, the cases in this study were bicyclists who were treated or who died from head injuries. The controls were bicyclists who were treated for non-head injuries after a bicycle crash. The results showed that you were 69% less likely to suffer any type of head injury if you were wearing a helmet versus not. You were 65% less likely to suffer a brain injury if you were wearing a helmet. You were 74% less likely to suffer a severe or traumatic brain injury if you were wearing a helmet. In a subsequent study a few years later, they also found that your risks of facial injury were reduced by 66% if you were wearing a bike helmet. And again, keep in mind, bike helmets are not like motorcycle helmets. They don't have windshields on the front of them or what have you. They're generally open on the front, but just that sort of brim that they have can actually create some physical distance between your face and the ground or whatever object you run into, and it can reduce facial injuries by 66%. So helmets work. One very common way of promoting helmet use in children, not just on bicycles, but also on skateboards and scooters and any other form of transportation where crashes might occur, is to actually, during well visit checks, to educate parents and caregivers, and also to sometimes provide helmets. There are health departments that get grants sometimes, and they actually go into houses and neighborhoods and give training on how to use helmets, and then they pass out the helmets, and the kids then have helmets that they can use. So that can't be the reason that they're not using them anymore. Legislation has also been proposed. Like a lot of other public health legislation, it's relatively easy to pass laws restricting the freedom of children because they're children. They're under the protection of a parent, a guardian, and somewhat by the state in general. So it's easy to it's easier to get laws to restrict the freedom of a child than it is to restrict the freedom of an adult. So for the most part, legislation is mostly focused on helmets for children, for people under the age of 18. One county in Maryland, the helmets use increased from 4% to 47% after legislation was proposed. It wasn't even enacted, it was proposed to make all people riding bicycles, adults and children, wear helmets. When California introduced legislation making it a requirement to wear a helmet if you were under the age of 17 and riding a bicycle, there was an 18% decrease in traumatic brain injuries after that. Up north of here, in Canada, there was a legislation introduced to require helmets for all bicycle riders under the age of 18. It didn't necessarily make a huge change in head injury numbers, but those numbers have been trending downward even before the laws happened, and they continue to trend downward after the laws were enacted. So it's one of those cases where you can never know if the progress would have plateaued without the legislation or if it would have continued. But the downward trend did continue after the legislation came to be. So if you're wondering about the state of current helmet laws in the United States, it's a dynamic and ever-changing thing, but as of this recording, there are 22 states plus the District of Columbia that have statewide laws. Most of these laws cover children under the age of 16. Some states have coverage that starts when you're under 18, under 14, or under 12. Nevada does not have any statewide laws mandating helmets, even for children. There are several local ordinances across the nation. I talked briefly about one county in Maryland that introduced a local ordinance for it. Here in Nevada, the Duckwater Indian Reservation and the Reno Sparks Indian Colony both have local ordinances that everybody riding a bicycle in these colonies and reservations has to be wearing a helmet. But in terms of state laws that require adults to wear helmets, there's a few local ordinances, but there are no state laws that require this. This is becoming a bit more concerning as e-bikes become more of a thing. Type 3 e-bikes can go up to 28 miles per hour with their electrical assist, so they're almost getting into the territory of a moped. But the laws have not been changed to reflect the new reality with e-bikes, and as of right now, there's still no state laws requiring adults to wear helmets when on anything that's considered to be a bicycle, even an e-bike. So in injury prevention, and really in public health in general, our focus is always upstream. It always should be upstream to try to eliminate a hazard, keep it from ever occurring in the first place. And we'll talk about that very briefly later on when we talk about complete streets and actually making areas and neighborhoods where people can bike safer, sort of be free from the hazard of being exposed to motor vehicles. Unfortunately, with the way we currently do transportation planning in the U.S. and the current grids we have in a lot of cities, the current way that things are laid out, it does kind of fall upon bicyclists to do a lot of things individually to protect themselves from hazards. One of these is you need to be smart and be seen. You need to make sure that you always have good reflectors on your bike so you can be seen in profile, also on the front and back. It's always good to have an actual flashing light on the back and a headlight on the front, and to wear bright and reflective clothing. Always keeping in mind, how far away do you need to be seen? If you're bicycling on the shoulder of a high-speed road, you want to be seen from a great distance away. This maximizes the opportunity that a motorist will notice you and not veer off and collide into you at high speeds, which is generally fatal. Studies going all the way back to 1976, the original Lot and Lot study that looked into this, have confirmed that if you want to lower the risk of bicycle collisions occurring, you need to have dedicated bicycle facilities. And on-the-road bike routes are good, on-the-road marked bike lanes, but off-road bike paths being by far the most preferred because, again, you get physical separation between motorists and bicyclists. Having these types of facilities can reduce collision incidents by 53%, as was found in the original 1976 study. One thing that increases both motorist and local resident awareness of bicycles and kind of gets people feeling more confident about bicycles and using them as an alternate form of transportation is a phenomenon of pop-up bike lanes, which we'll talk about now. A lot of cities did pop-up bike lanes during the COVID-19 pandemic when there wasn't as much of a need for on-street parking. And so a lot of cities decided we're going to convert some of these on-street parking areas and maybe even one of the lanes of through traffic into a dedicated bike lane, sort of a pop-up. We'll put up cones or flower pots, as you see up here in the upper left, and we'll actually get citizens out here and have them feel secure that, you can bike to places now. We have a safe and dedicated place for you. Now, not all these pop-up bike lanes are necessarily going to eventually become permanent, dedicated bike lanes, but this definitely improves cyclist awareness by both motorists and potential cyclists. And it's good for public health. It gets people out there. You can see a lot more of your town if you're on a bicycle versus just driving by quickly in a motor vehicle. It can be used for traffic calming. It's been repeatedly shown that as you make lanes, as you get fewer lanes and narrower lanes, it brings down speeds of cars and makes a safer place for bicyclists to go. So pop-up bike lanes are something that I hope continues on even after COVID-19. We'll now shift our attention to by far the most vulnerable of all road users, pedestrians. In a given year in the United States, a little over 7,000 pedestrians will be killed. That's about 20 per day. There will be about 68,000 pedestrian injuries in a given year. That's about 1 every 7 minutes. Almost all of these fatal injuries are due to pedestrian interactions with motor vehicles. There are a very small fraction of them that come from where a pedestrian is struck by a bicycle or a skateboard or some other non-motorized vehicle. But it takes an unusually large amount of force being transferred for that to occur. So it's almost always motor vehicles that are the source of these deaths. If you want to look at the cost of injury data for medical plus value of statistical life combined costs in the year 2023, it was about $116 billion. According to data from the Governor's Highway Safety Administration, in the most recent year for which data was available, 18% of all people killed in traffic crashes were pedestrians. 65% of these pedestrian deaths were in locations without a sidewalk, so that the pedestrian was having to walk in the road, not separated from motor vehicle traffic in any meaningful, significant way. 77% of these pedestrian fatalities were when the conditions of the lighting were known. 77% of them occurred after dark. Now, in not every single pedestrian crash was this data available, but for the ones where it was known, a little over 3/4 of them happened after dark. And 29% of these pedestrian fatalities, the pedestrian had a blood alcohol concentration higher than the legal driving limit of 0.08. Now, we should never try to assign too much blame to the most vulnerable road users for things that happen that cause their injuries, but we do need to acknowledge the fact that alcohol does impede people's judgment, and a lot of times it makes people underestimate the danger that they might be in. They might step in front of a car because they misjudge the distance, so it is a factor a lot of the time. One of the articles you were assigned to read this week is from the Hickox Research Group, published in the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, looking at disparities in pedestrian deaths in Clark County, Nevada from the years 2008 to 2011. What they found was that the population likelihood to be killed in a pedestrian crash, again looking at rates per 100,000, that tourists didn't have a particularly high rate. It was 1.1 per 100,000. This is still higher than a lot of other metro areas, just because we have such a big volume of tourists here in Las Vegas and Clark County. The housed residential population had a slightly higher rate, 1.4 per 100,000. And then the unhoused, or homeless, had by far the highest rate, 30.7 per 100,000. The time of day also made a big difference in pedestrian deaths. For housed residents, the highest rate of pedestrian deaths was between 6 p.m. and 11:59 p.m. For tourists, the highest rate was between midnight and 5:59 a.m. And for homeless, by far the highest rate, in fact, the time when almost all deaths occurred, was between 6 p.m. and 11:59 p.m. There's going to be a discussion post assigned to you where you're going to have to sort of discuss the findings of this study and also the study done by Farr, Kogenauer, and Mungum, 3 professors here at UNLV. This is it's interesting to look at the neighborhood characteristics. What you see from here is that most of the residential pedestrian deaths occurred on the east side of the Las Vegas Valley. Most of the visitor deaths occurred in and around the Las Vegas Strip. That's not a surprise. Much of the homeless population deaths also occurred in the east and northeast parts of the valley. Again, when you make your discussion posts about this, you can give me some of your opinions on this and other things that you read. When we widen our lens a little bit outside of just Las Vegas and Clark County and look at all U.S. pedestrian deaths, we see some health disparities, sort of like we do with a lot of other public health outcomes, and certainly a lot of injury outcomes. Male pedestrians are more likely to die and more likely to be injured compared to female pedestrians. Teens and young adults, those aged 15 to 29, are more likely to be treated in an emergency department. And alcohol, again, is a major cause and effect in a lot of these pedestrian deaths. Intoxicated pedestrian crashes are much more likely to be fatal, about 5 times more likely if a pedestrian is intoxicated. You can imagine why that is. If you're highly intoxicated, your judgment is impaired, you might have some visual impairments, you don't process and sense danger as quickly as somebody who is sober would, so this is not too surprising. Pedestrian deaths in the United States are a lot like many other negative public health outcomes in that they disproportionately impact minorities and also people in lower socioeconomic status for reasons that you're probably all too familiar with at this point. They have to do with people of lower socioeconomic status, which are disproportionately minorities, often have to walk more because they can't afford a car, or they have a car but they can't afford the newest repair to it, or they live in neighborhoods where the built environment isn't as safe for walking or for bicycling or for driving or for many other things as well. Individuals with disabilities and elderly persons are more likely to suffer from pedestrian deaths because they can't move as fast and like crosswalks and places like that. There's certainly some underlying fragilities that we all get as we get older that make it more likely that we will die as a result of kinetic forces being applied to us. And then, like we talked about before, unhoused persons are a lot more likely to die as pedestrians. You can imagine some of the reasons for this as well. A lot of times unhoused persons will stand by the side of the road with signs trying to collect donations. They're in very close proximity to quick moving traffic, and that's always a recipe for bad things to happen. While they are not uniformly enforced, there actually are laws in Nevada dealing with the safety of pedestrians. One interesting law in Nevada is that even if it's not marked, a crosswalk exists at any intersection, even if there's no pavement markings. So pedestrians have a right to be in a crosswalk when it's their turn, based on light cycles or stop cycles or whatever the case may be. There's also laws that apply to drivers in regards to pedestrians. Drivers must yield to pedestrians in crosswalks. They must yield at all times to somebody with a visual impairment who's using a cane or a service animal. And the one here in the box is very interesting. Drivers actually are supposed to stop or slow down before passing another vehicle that's stopped in a travel lane until the driver has determined whether or not the vehicle is stopping for a pedestrian. I see this a lot of times in crosswalks that don't have lights or other ways to get drivers' attention. There will be somebody in one lane that's stopped for a pedestrian, and somebody will zoom around this stopped car thinking, why is this car stopped? And they don't check to see, it's because there's a pedestrian crossing in front of that car, and soon that pedestrian is going to cross in front of me. There's a couple of YouTube clips here that you can watch if you want to. One of them shows a crosswalk in California where 9 different cars completely fail to yield for pedestrians during the brief time that this crosswalk is being recorded. And then another YouTube video showing a man walking his child, probably to school or something like that, and somebody drives across the crosswalk without yielding, and the father responds by kicking the side of the car, as many of us have probably been tempted to do at times. If you don't build road infrastructure with pedestrians in mind, you end up with situations where negative interactions between pedestrians and motor vehicles, by which I mean interactions that can cause serious injuries and fatalities, you make those a lot more likely. For years, here in the Las Vegas Valley, we had one particular problem on this long stretch of Eastern Avenue between Sunset Road and Warm Springs Road. To the right on this picture is Sunset Park, and there was a long 1 mile stretch between Sunset and Warm Springs where there was no crosswalk or no crossing place for pedestrians across Eastern Avenue. If you lived in some of those houses to the west of Eastern Avenue and wanted to go to Sunset Park, you either had to walk all the way up to Sunset Road, all the way down to Warm Springs Road, or what a lot of people did, unfortunately, was they ran across Eastern Avenue, which, because it's a multi-lane, relatively high-speed road, is a bad idea. Now, activism in the community and also in the UNLV School of Public Health, there were some faculty and students that got involved in this activism as well in this particular stretch of Eastern Avenue. And they presented the need for a crosswalk. They talked a lot about it. And then the Clark County in the last few years actually built a new crosswalk there at Mall Avenue and Eastern, so that it's a push button activated crosswalk, so that, when you push the button, the lights go on and all the traffic on Eastern Avenue comes to a stop, or is supposed to come to a stop, because there's somebody actively in the crosswalk. So yeah, this is a bad urban design can be corrected with activism and with improvements in design, but yeah, roads can be made for all users, including pedestrians.
So as an example on Eastern Avenue shows you, there are ways we can improve roads to greatly reduce the risk of pedestrian fatalities. Some road engineering approaches for prevention include increasing lighting at pedestrian crosswalks. If you have crosswalks at all, make them more brightly lit so that pedestrians in the crosswalk are seen. At intersections, no turn on red signs really do help a lot, because what happens a lot of times with vehicles at intersections is that if there's not a no turn on red sign and the driver's like, okay, I can turn right on red if there's no cars coming, they don't necessarily look for pedestrians who will have a green walk signal and are crossing the road in front of where they're getting ready to turn. So by preventing turns on red, that's a road engineering that greatly reduces the risk of pedestrian being run over. Having flashing crosswalk lights, like you see here in this picture from Petaluma up in the Bay Area, but we have some of these right here in Las Vegas as well, where you can push a button and activate the crosswalk lights. There's some of these on Flamingo right now. They're very bright, they're very noticeable, and for the most part, what I've seen is when they're activated, cars actually stop. Anytime you have a signaled intersection, having pedestrian countdown signals really helps a lot, because it gives pedestrians an idea of whether they're going to be able to make it across this multi-lane road or not. Because a lot of times people will start across a road, then they get about halfway and they realize that, uh-oh, I'm not going to make it. And that can be a pretty harrowing experience. So countdown signals help a lot. And as we'll talk about shortly, complete streets. If we could just design streets, particularly in urban areas, to be sensitive to the needs of all users, motorists and bicyclists and pedestrians, that would be the best thing of all. Preventing injuries and deaths in pedestrians is a lot like many other public health issues in that it's a social justice issue. Pedestrian injuries and fatalities disproportionately affect people based on socioeconomic status, race, and ethnicity. And like a lot of other public health problems, it really requires a systematic approach. Change systems to make a better, safer environment for everybody who has to walk or wants to walk. But with that being said, there are some individual responsibilities that pedestrians should take whenever they're walking to sort of be a smart pedestrian and reduce their risk of being injured and killed. One of the biggest ones being only cross in actual marked crosswalks. Do not jaywalk. A lot of times, the reason why fatalities occur is because drivers were not expecting to see a pedestrian in a certain place because they weren't supposed to be there. You should always be careful of drivers turning right on red. They're looking for the car that might be coming from the left that could crash into them. They're not necessarily looking at you. Wear bright reflective clothing at night, if possible. If you have to walk in the street, if you don't have a safe street that has its own dedicated sidewalk, if you have to walk in a street, make sure that you face traffic rather than having your back to it. The article embedded here tells a story about how back in 2015, some probably must have been some concerned parents near or people who live near Gouldsby Elementary School, near Desert Inn and 215 on the west side of the valley, kind of took it upon themselves to periodically 4 or 5 different times paint a fake crosswalk on Desert Inn Road to try to get pedestrians to slow down a little bit. While I'm sure many of us sort of appreciate the effort, that's not really a successful and good approach to doing this. If you're the driver, you need to always be mindful and empathetic and patient when you're driving in areas where pedestrians could be present. Here's an example from the east side of the Las Vegas Valley. That's Boulder Highway and Russell Road. Big major intersection. If you're crossing Boulder Highway, the north part, along Russell Road, you're going to have to cross 11 lanes of traffic. It can take up to 30 seconds to cross. Now, thankfully, they time the light cycle there to ensure that if you have sort of normal ability to move, that you can make it through there in 30 seconds. But of course, once again, there are some people that have mobility impairments that it might take them even longer to cross, maybe even longer than the light cycle allows. So just always be a mindful and empathetic and patient driver. This diagram also shows another one of those sort of bad urban design things that shows how these roads are really built for cars and didn't really consider the needs of pedestrians. You'll notice that if you're going to be driving on Russell Road, heading westbound, and you decide to turn north onto Boulder Highway, there's what's called a slip lane. That little lane you see veering off to the right then merges onto Boulder Highway. These lanes were put in a lot of intersections by traffic engineers who wanted to keep traffic moving. So instead of everybody having to wait at the red light, if you're going to turn right and the slip lane was not blocked by too many cars at that intersection, you could actually relatively quickly go over there and turn right. The big problem with slip lanes is that, of course, it's very easy to have a collision with a pedestrian in a slip lane because people aren't often looking for pedestrians when they're trying to take this relatively quick right turn from one major road onto another. So always be careful when you're driving through one of these slip lanes. You just never know when a pedestrian is going to pop up.
What should go without saying, but I will say it anyways, that a reduction in speed limits within areas where pedestrians are likely to be present can save a lot of lives. This data I'm showing you now is a combination of Department of Transportation and AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety data. And if you're struck by a car that's going 23 miles per hour and you're a pedestrian, your risk of death is 10%. If that car is just going 9 miles per hour faster, 32 miles per hour, your risk of death as a pedestrian goes up to 25%. You can see that when you get to 42 miles per hour of the rate of speed of the vehicle, that the pedestrian risk of death is now 50%. And you can see that by the time you have a vehicle going 58 miles per hour, if a pedestrian is struck, the risk of death for the pedestrian goes up to 90%. Unfortunately, this is very common here in the Vegas Valley because we have a lot of those 7-lane boulevards, particularly going east to west across our valley. And they have posted speed limits of 45 miles per hour, but people routinely go about 60 miles per hour in between lights on those roads such as Tropicana, DI, Flamingo. So any pedestrian that ever gets struck by vehicles going this speed are likely to suffer a fatal injury.
While it's been a little bit slower to take root here in the United States compared to Western Europe and some other places, many municipalities are starting to embrace sustainability and trying to reduce congestion inside their urban cores and reduce their carbon footprint and make their cities more livable. And encouraging active transportation, meaning encouraging bicycling and walking, is being promoted in a lot of metropolitan areas as a more sustainable form of transportation. And again, you get less congestion, you get fewer greenhouse gases. As citizens have more physical activity because they're choosing a more active form of transportation, the thought is this might help address the obesity epidemic that still continues to be a problem here in the United States. Plus, if we're being honest, we need to admit that driving can be a very stressful activity. And if we can commute in some ways other than driving, be it public transport or active transport, probably going to feel healthier because as people drive, there's been lots of biometric data showing that our stress responses increase. We have increased secretion of urinary stress hormones, more increases in irregular heartbeat, an unstable angina, increased blood pressure, and a lower tolerance for frustration. That's part of the reason why a lot of times we act in cars, particularly in frustrating traffic, in a way that we would not act at home, even if presented with frustrations and difficulties. So yeah, if we can get fewer people driving, there will actually be some mental health benefits as well. If we want to effectively promote active transport, and if we want to promote social justice and a better world, we need to provide a safe environment for everybody to walk and bike, not just for people in affluent neighborhoods. The Complete Streets Initiative was started by Smart Growth America, an advocacy group, about 20 years ago. It was an effort to sort of make cities a more just place for everybody, where whether you have a car or don't, that the city can be an inviting place for you. Some of the components of the Complete Streets Initiative have since been adopted by the U.S. Department of Transportation, and there's many state, city, and local governments that are starting to apply some of these principles as well to their urban design and urban projects. If you're wondering what are complete streets, the little red box here explains somewhat the principle of it. Complete streets are for everyone. They're designed to prioritize safety, comfort, and access to destinations for all people who use the street, especially those who have experienced systemic underinvestment or some of the social and justice issues we talked about earlier. Complete streets make it easier to cross the street, walk to shops, jobs, and schools, bike to work, move actively if you have assistive devices. Basically, they encourage engineers and city planners to routinely design and operate the entire right-of-way of a street to prioritize safer, slower speeds for all people who use the road, rather than just emphasizing high speeds for motor vehicles. The goal of Complete Streets is that every transportation project will make the street network better and safer for people who are walking, biking, driving, riding transit, and moving actively with assistive devices, making the town a better place to live. Some of these principles are starting to be applied even here in Las Vegas. The city of Las Vegas used some Complete Streets initiative ideas when they were redesigning Main Street from St. Louis to Charleston. If you've been on that stretch of Main Street now, it's been redone. It has like narrower lanes to like sort of reduce speed limits. It's got a lot more crosswalks that are very bright and visible. It's got planters along the side to sort of brighten up the streetscape, wider sidewalks so that people who have assistive devices, people who need to walk, can do so safely. It's got bike lanes. It's just been completely redone using a lot of these Complete Streets ideas. And it's actually done a lot of good things. There's many breweries that have moved in, art galleries. That whole stretch of Main Street has been reborn using some of the Complete Streets Initiative ideas. And it's probably safe for pedestrians now, too, as a result. And just as a reiteration, if you're wondering why it's so important for us to consider complete streets in the urban projects going forward, it's because The way that we've designed our cities up to this point has been very unsafe, particularly for African American, American Indians, Alaska Natives, for people with mobility issues, for the elderly. There's a burden of danger for pedestrians that's not shared equally. And complete streets can help make the roads safer for everybody. We discussed in the elder abuse lecture about how our society is still aging, how by the year 2034, there's going to be more people over the age of 65 than there is under the age of 18. The way we've designed our cities and municipalities up to this point has been pretty unsafe for people over the age of 75, as you can see from here. They're disproportionately killed in pedestrian collisions. Along with race, ethnicity, and age, socioeconomic status often means that people live in more dangerous built environments. People that walk in lower income areas are struck and killed at much higher rates compared to people who walk in wealthier neighborhoods. As you see from this is census tract level data. So this doesn't necessarily say that the people who were killed in these pedestrian collisions were in these particular income bands, so much as this is the income profile of the census tract in which the fatality occurred. But for a lot of these cases, yeah, it's the same sort of disproportionate impact we see with so many public health problems. And it's something that if we just worked upstream a little bit more, we could make a better, safer place for everybody. And that's what we should work toward.
So in final summary now, whether it's drivers in motor vehicles, passengers in motor vehicles, bicyclists, or pedestrians, traffic-related crashes are responsible for a significant amount of mortality and morbidity. And there are profound societal disparities for deaths in motor vehicles, on bicycles, and as pedestrians. There are feasible prevention measures available to prevent these deaths and serious injuries, but we must support and advocate for them. Some of them might require fundamental changes to the way we live. And as public health-minded people who also believe in equity and social justice, we might have to advocate for some things that might not always be popular. One thought I will leave you with, and I'm convinced of this, it is not likely possible to prioritize both speed and safety. If we want to have greater safety on our roads here in the United States, we probably need to de-emphasize speed, particularly in urban areas. There are some rural, limited access areas where it might make more sense to allow higher speed limits, but some of the speed limits we have right here in the Vegas Valley on roads where interactions with not just pedestrians and bicyclists, but now even sort of lower speed semi-motorized vehicles like e-bikes and things like that. A lot of times these will also be using the same roads, and to have very fast moving 2 and 3 ton motor vehicles on the same roads as some of these other things is just, it's a recipe for a lot of tragedies to occur. So I really believe and hope that going forward we will prioritize safety rather than speed, particularly in areas where these interactions between motor vehicles and vulnerable road users are most likely. So that's it for this week. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you for your attention today.